Hello, my name is Andre. My main claim today is that the result of further human overpopulation will lead to decreased food security. Alright, so let's define overpopulation and food security first off. So overpopulation occurs when the population density enlarges to a limit in which provokes environmental deterioration, or a remarkable decline in the quality of life for the population, or a population collapse altogether. Now, what is food security? Food security is defined as all people having access to the food required for a person to lead a healthy life at all times. Now, clean drinking water is also included in food security. Alright, so the subjects that I'm going to hit on today are, firstly, I'm going to go over the population, where the population is at right now, the human population. Secondly, I'm going to go over food security and why food insecurity is a huge concern right now and will be in the future and has been in the past. Thirdly, I'm going to go over the consequences of food insecurity. Alright, so first off, there's no doubt that the human population, the human civilization has gone far since its first civilization. We've had a great number of technological advances as well as agricultural advances, which are benefiting to us benefiting in the longevity of our lives. By the increase of nutrition, sanitation, and medical care, people are able to live longer, and with higher birth rates and lower mortality rates, people are able to live longer, and thus goes into my point why the population is growing exponentially. The population has grown from the 1800s to today, February 2nd, 2015, from 1 billion people to 7.2 billion people. Alright, in the 1800s, the first billion was reached. 100 years later, in the 1900s, the population went from 1 billion to 1.6 billion. And from 1900s to the 1950, population went from 1.6 billion to 2.5 billion. Small jump, but the large peak occurs from 1950 to today, where the population jumped from 2.5 billion to 7.2 billion people. Based on the researcher of the United Nations, the human population is expected to peak by the year 2050 with an estimated population of 9.2 billion people, which is stated as a low estimate on the United Nations side. They're just factoring in what may occur in detrimenting the human population or increasing the human population. Alright, secondly, we're going to go over food security. With a population that's growing exponentially, food security is a major concern. There are countless examples of millions of people dying from starvation and famine. One example would be the Irish potato blight, which occurred in the mid-1800s, where it killed off 3 million people. Second example could be just 50 years ago in China, 30 million people fell victim to starvation just in China. And we have starvation going on right now in developing countries right now. The risk of famine is already an issue, and a larger growth in the population will only increase the likelihood of starvation in both industrialized and developing countries. There's also already food insecurity in highly populated countries, as well as our country right here. 4% of the United States population undergoes food insecurity, where they don't have enough food to survive. They are going through starvation. Based on the research of the International Food Policy Research Institute, there is a need for food production to double in order for the world to sustain another 2 billion people by the year 2050 and allow for them to have food security. The demand for grain by 2050 will increase by 35%, and the demand for meat will increase by 60%. Just going into why we need higher production of food by the year 2050 and 35 years in order to sustain life. However, with substantially higher population densities in the near future, food security will be solely based on wealth and in the region in which one lives. Because food prices are obviously going to go up because there's going to be food shortages, most likely. Currently, the areas with the highest food insecurity are also the regions that have the greatest population densities. So these areas with the highest food insecurities are going to be South and East Asia, as well as some areas in Africa where they're going to have, where the developing countries are, and there's a lot of people. Thirdly, the consequences of food insecurity. With food becoming scarce in the world, there would be more sickness and disease. With more sickness and diseases in families, people are going to be forced out of work and put into poverty due to their lack of ability to work and provide for their families. With a lack of work and therefore a lack of money, it makes it even more difficult for food to be acquired by families, and thus children will be forced out of school in order to provide for their families, find food where they can. Thirdly, developing countries will be victim to massive starvation, and industrialized countries will have to deal with increased food prices due to shortages. So a world struck by starvation will put education aside and focus on survival, and thus with more people being brought into the world with a lower mortality rate, food production is going to have to increase in order to sustain the life that we live today by the year 2050. Thank you.
All right, we got a clear proposition. The contents of the speech, I think you present a structure, but none of them are really phrased as claims. It all sounds like you've got this narrative description of issues that are being researched, and I think you need to make them into more distinct declarative claims to make this a stronger argument. In the body of the speech, I thought you did a little bit better job at that, and as you went along, you kind of explained where the claims are, although there are a couple of places, particularly near the end, when we get a whole series of asserted claims that are being used to create a chain of arguments that I think is underdeveloped. It's just based on some premises that you're building up earlier without a discussion of what's controversial about any of those premises. The notion that the population is automatically going to grow, I think you've given us some good reason to believe that that's likely, but the idea that we'll outstrip food production, I think I think you need a little bit more information. For example, the information that you had about food security in the United States, that I don't think that's been demonstrated to be related to what's available. It's related to what people can afford, or whether or not people have access to it, not based on, there's a shortage of grain, that that 4% in the U.S. is starving or is problematic because we aren't producing enough corn, enough grain, enough meats, or any of those sorts of things. I think that the same kind of problem applies on the broader scale. The notion that we have insufficient amount of production based on the population, I think ignores some of the other issues that are related, that might very well be related to population, but you've kind of focused on the production of food, and I think that if that's going to be your claim, you need to have some stronger information on those particular points. But it's reasonably well presented. Like I said, in the last third, I think there are a whole series of inferences that need a lot more documentation. There's also several places in the speech where you present material that seems like it's factual data, and I don't doubt that some of it is true, but I'm not getting any source citation on that information, and I think you need to be more consistent about that also.